Operation Absolute Resolve was a success. The US captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in a move to fight the South American cartels. Or was it? CIA operatives successfully infiltrated Venezuela not recently, but months ago in August 2025, collecting intelligence on the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. They moved around the city of Caracas undetected for months, despite the US Embassy within Venezuela being closed since March of 2019, due to the US recognition of Maduro's opposition, Juan Guaido, as Venezuela's legitimate interim president. Without diplomatic coverage, operatives were still able to move about the city, taking down information pivotal to the success of the January 3rd attack and kidnapping of the Venezuelan President Maduro himself. Those CIA operatives took in information such as the president's movements, Maduro's daily routines. They identified compounds and fallback locations. They coordinated with a human source close to Maduro and integrated stealth drone surveillance. The attack that happened was planned well in advance. January 2nd, 2026, President Trump gave the final go order, leading to the actual attack on January 3rd. Very early in the morning, around 2 a.m., Venezuela was hit on multiple fronts. The US launched a cyber operation that cut power to large areas of Caracas, plunging the city into darkness. Then, 150 US aircraft consisting of fighters, bombers, drones, and helicopters were deployed. Radar sites, air defense batteries, and radio towers were struck. Their initial intent was to clear a safe air corridor for helicopters. Even after this, according to a few reports, US helicopters still came under fire, one actually being hit with several soldiers injured. Aircraft responded with overwhelming force. Once the area was cleared, elite DELTAFORCE operators were inserted by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Their target, Maduro's compound, was sitting directly on Venezuela's most fortified military base. Operators breached the compound using explosives, and reports say it only took them 3 minutes to reach Maduro after entry. He attempted to escape, but within 5 minutes, DELTAFORCE had Maduro in custody. An FBI negotiator was present, but not needed. Maduro and his wife were flown out by helicopter, being transferred to the USS Iwo Jima, positioned 100 miles offshore, then moved to Guantanamo Bay. Later, being moved again to New York City to face federal drug and weapons charges. According to Venezuelan officials, 40 people were killed, both military personnel and civilians. Trump declared the US is now in charge of Venezuela with the intent to rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure, even warning other Venezuelan leaders that they can be next. So, how did we get to this point? Was this an operation to help the US by combating narco-terrorism? Or something else? The primary public rhetoric was that this attack was under narcotics safety, but it's clear that this wasn't the full rationale. The operation itself was framed as a counter-narcotics and law enforcement action. The Department of Justice charges were on drug trafficking and weapons offenses. Donald Trump explicitly described the raid as a strike against narco-terrorism, emphasizing drug trafficking, public safety, and criminal accountability. This anti-narcotic rhetoric may have simply been the justification, but not the strategic driver. The operation was sold as a drug bust, but it unfolded like a strategic seizure. For years, Venezuela and its strategic resources have appeared repeatedly in US Venezuela policy, even decades before the drug rhetoric entered the picture. Venezuela was always a US interest, going back to even before the 1980s, even before the 1940s. And not to mention, this exact play, what we saw done in Venezuela on January 3rd, 2026, was already done many years ago, but in Panama. Let's cover how narcotics was used yet again as a justification for a strategic seizure. Let's first cover what the resources captured in Venezuela are, then compare it to its sister operation within Panama many years back. Simply put, this was about influence and oil. Those were the actual main drivers for the Operation Absolute Resolve. Why we truly entered Venezuela this week. Let's first cover the US's concern with oil within Venezuela back in the day and why it matters now. In the 1940s, around World War II, and with early Cold War foundations, Venezuelan crude oil was treated as strategically important to the Allied fuel supply, as Venezuela was a major exporter. The US at this time ran many security and sabotage reports, and its intel showing a lot of attention was placed on the vulnerability of petroleum installations within Venezuela and nearby. 1950 to 51, the US flat out stated an official policy that it would assure an adequate supply of petroleum, especially in time of war. Around the same time, foreign relations of the United States, under FRUS, tied oil access to US security. Policies were enacted to emphasize ensuring Venezuela has a reliable US market, since now US security depends on access to this specific nearby petroleum source. Even in trade itself in this time, Venezuela's exports to the US were overwhelmingly petroleum products. On National Security Council papers, within the NSC series in the late 1940s to early 50s, it made it clear that nearby friendly oil sources were a priority, with Venezuela being singled out as perhaps one of the most important. In the 1960s, the US planned discussions that included helping Venezuela protect oil fields and related installations. Oil leverage is extremely political. Venezuelan leadership presses the US on oil import restrictions and quotas consistently. It has always been a diplomatic pressing point between the two. For us, volumes on inter-American affairs around the time made it clear the US was pushing its influence here, ensuring Venezuela exported oil to the US under protections. Then, in the 60s and 70s, US internal policy papers treat oil import quotas as justified on national security grounds, at the time being pretty controversial and contentious. This wider policy environment, where Venezuela's oil supply really mattered to the US. This changed Venezuela from being a great source of oil to a necessary one under security concern. This entire time frame and since, around the Cold War and beyond, CIA assessments repeatedly note that instability in Venezuela would threaten production and export of petroleum, and that oil installations are vulnerable to sabotage. This entire time, Oil is treated as a strategic vulnerability, and it's constantly repeated within reports on why US influence needs to be stable within this region. From the 1940s onward, the US record repeatedly treats Venezuela less as a normal bilateral partner and more so a strategic energy asset. Oil reliability and infrastructure security are, and have always been, national security objectives. From the 1940s to 80s, the US cared about anti-communism, oil security, and regional alignment. Venezuela was pro-US, anti-communist, and oil-rich, making it a strategic partner, not a target. The US supported, protected, and stabilized Venezuela to keep the oil flowing and to deny Soviet influence in the Caribbean basin. In practice, this included security cooperation, military assistance, intelligence sharing, and a quiet tolerance of authoritarian tendencies, as long as alignment to US interests held, and as long as there was oil. Venezuela didn't need saving at the time. It just needed to stay friendly and stable. This is why around this time, Cold War documents talk about oil, coups, labor unrest, and sabotage, not drugs. There was no narco-terrorism rhetoric. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, communism stopped working as a public justification for US overreach, but the US strategic needs did not disappear. This creates almost a justification vacuum. Simply put, after this, we see a shift from anti-communism rhetoric, one of the largest reasons we needed a stronghold of influence in Venezuela's region, to new reasoning: drugs. Pushing out drugs solves many of the problems the US faced once it lost its biggest reason to keep influence strong within Venezuela. Drug trafficking is criminal, not political, enabling actions such as raids. Public safety sells better over the other items such as geopolitics. This helps the US frame operations to be law enforcement, not imperial action, reducing any kind of backlash. Once Venezuela broke alignment to US interests under Chavez, expelling US agencies such as the DEA, once it started aligning with rivals such as China and Russia, the oil remained, but the cooperation, the influence, is lost. At that very moment, Venezuela flipped from being a protected strategic asset to a problematic one that may be lost. A security concern that now has to be acted upon. China's involvement in Venezuela runs deep in oil, having many long-standing investments into Venezuelan oil and financing. State-owned energy companies such as the China National Petroleum Corporation, the CNPC, and Sinopec worked in tandem to displace US and Western oil firms over time. These Chinese companies didn't just buy the oil, they restructured who Venezuela depended on for their export. Russia has supplied weapons, training, and defense systems to Venezuela over decades, using state-controlled defense institutions such as the Rosenboronexport, Rostec, and Russia's own Ministry of Defense to send and enable loans to Venezuela for them to buy weapons such as air defense systems, tanks, aircraft, all of which were publicly reported in the 2000s. Even in 2019, Congress passed the Russian-Venezuelan Threat Mitigation Act to assess Russia's influence due to rising Russian influential concerns, treating this, Russia and Venezuela, as yet another security concern. So it's not a surprise at all that both China and Russia condemned the US over its attack on Venezuela. But at this point, we can see why the US did it. The operation perhaps being nothing more than to steal back influence over the region, starting with its largest oil exporter, Venezuela. Under petroleum-based and influential security concerns, of course the US would move in. And how better to do this than to repeat a previous successful operation? Operation Just Cause. Operation Just Cause was perhaps the precursor to Operation Absolute Resolve. On December 20th, 1989, the US invaded Panama with 17,000 US troops that overwhelmed the Panamanian Defense Forces, being around 15,000 strong themselves, with air, land, and special operations. Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega eventually surrendered on January 3rd, 1990, taken to the US to face drug trafficking charges. Now, doesn't that sound a little similar? The resemblance is very uncanny. Public rationale at the time was to capture Noriega on drug charges, to protect US citizens and property within Panama, to defend democracy and human rights after Noriega annulled his opponent's elections and victories, and to protect the Panama Canal and related treaties such as the Torrijos-Carter Treaty. Everything except for the treaty part is a direct match with what happened in Venezuela. Drug charges, annulled elections, with the US recognizing the opponent, protection of US citizens down to even the date. Both operations ultimately being successful on January 3rd of the respective years. The strategic importance of Panama cannot be understated, being one of the most significant trading hubs of the world. Just like Venezuela with Maduro, Noriega leading Panama became an unstable security concern. Around this time, the US had a loss of leverage. Noriega turned Panama into a financial hub for money laundering, offshore banking, enabling safe passage for illicit flows, and it turned into a crossroads for intelligence services. In short, Noriega was harder to pressure and less predictable than before, getting less cooperative with the US and refusing to leave office when the US demanded it. Essentially, not sticking under US influence. Again, a little similar to what happened with Maduro. Panama turned into a security concern, and public justification was mostly of narcotics and US citizen safety. But the strategic importance and resource of the Panama Canal was being lost under US influence. So, as we saw with Venezuela, the US military intervened. They took control, charged the current leader with drug-related crimes, and instilled US rule and promised to help the people, but most importantly, to help US influence stay over a valuable strategic resource. To summarize everything, it seems the US had yet another operation under the public justification of narco-terrorism and US citizen safety, but in reality, ran seizures of strategic resources. Just as Noriega of Panama became hard to control under US interest, Maduro of Venezuela was cutting ties to the US in more ways than one, resulting in a repeat operations in many ways. Different places, different times, and those operations technically being very different, but with the same justification, the same charges, and ultimately resulting in a seizure of resources with instillment of US influence. So, what do you guys think? Isn't it crazy that both operations were operationally successful on the same day, January 3rd? Was the attack on Venezuela for public safety? Or something else? Perhaps just influence in oil? Well, let's take a cryptid clue.